Welcome to the Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival, and tonight's event, a conversation and Q&A with the directors of Picture a Scientist, Sharon Shattuck and Ian Chaney, moderated by Jeannie Hardy. This event is co-sponsored by the UMass Biotechnology Training Program. I'm Daniel Pope, the director of the 28th season of the MMFF, together with my assistant curator, Nefeli Forni Safudaki. The theme for the 2021 season is Alliances, presenting an international program of films and media that explore what divides us and what is possible when we choose to align ourselves with others. Please see our website at umass.edu/film/MMFF for information about the festival, upcoming events, and to find a list of our sponsors. It's our pleasure to welcome Sharon Shattuck and Ian Chaney, and I'm pleased to present our moderator for tonight's conversation and Q&A, Jeannie Hardy, Professor of Chemistry at UMass Amherst, Associate Head of the Department of Chemistry, Director of the Biotechnology Training Program. Professor Hardy.
Good evening, Daniel. Thank you so much for the invitation to moderate this discussion. I have to say that as a female scientist, Picture a Scientist has really been a wonderful film to share with my friends and my colleagues, and I've enjoyed it so much that I've watched it twice with my 13-year-old son. Tonight we have Sharon Shattuck and Ian Chaney, the co-directors of this film. So I'd like to tell the audience a little bit about these directors and the work that they've done. Sharon Shattuck is a documentary film director, a TV producer, and is the co-host of the podcast Conviction, American Panic, about the satanic panic that was prevalent in the 1980s. Her most recent film, which you have all now seen, is Picture a Scientist. Sharon herself has a science background. She has a degree from the University of Michigan in forest ecology. She also has a master's degree in journalism from NYU. Other films that she's created include From This Day Forward, about growing up with a transgender parent. And she's also co-creator of the Emmy-nominated New York Times OpDocs science series, Animated Life. Her work has appeared in many venues, including on PBS, Netflix, National Geographic, Slate, Vice, Vox, The Atlantic, Spotify, and Radiolab. Her co-director is Ian Chaney. Ian is an American documentary filmmaker as well. He's a cinematographer, and he has produced 10 feature-length documentaries, including Picture a Scientist. Chaney grew up in Massachusetts and in Maine. He earned a bachelor's and master's degree from Yale University and Master's of Fine Arts from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Ian has been awarded the Peabody Award for his documentary King Corn. He was also the youngest awardee for the Heinz Award for films which focus on the environment. Ian received an Emmy nomination for his film The Dark City, which aired on PBS Point of View. Ian runs the Wicked Delicate Films group, and his most recent film, The Long Coast, premiered just this past October. Welcome, Ian and Sharon. It's so great to have you with us here at the Multicultural Film Festival.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. So, as I mentioned earlier, this has been a really wonderful film to see, and it focuses on scientists like myself. So, Sharon, we know that you have a background in science, but I'm curious about how this film came together. How did the two of you meet? How did you get the idea for the film? What was the genesis of this idea?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. Ian and I have been working together for over 10 years now, because we actually kind of found each other because we're both really interested in science and we both have a background in science. And so I was coming from forest ecology, and he was making the city dark, and it just, I started out kind of animating some of his films because I like to draw things, and then we've kind of, evolved our collaboration from there. But yeah, with this particular film, I think Ian actually was, he first was in touch with Amy Brand at the MIT Press. And she told Ian about this woman, Nancy Hopkins, and this, interesting story of the MIT 16, and I think it was pretty early on. Ian was like, "Hey, Sharon, I think you should check this out. Like, this is a really interesting story. Maybe we can do something with this." And so that's kind of where the like, ooh,
I have autolights.
gotta wait.
If you're too still, they come up.
Yeah, so that's kind of where it started was with Nancy Hopkins, and then Ian brought me in, and we both were just we love Nancy. Like immediately when we talked to her, we were just like, wow, she's amazing. And so first we thought maybe this could be a film about just the MIT story. But then as we were kind of, talking to more people, we were doing a lot of research behind the scenes. We realized that this is, the issues that women in science face, they haven't been solved, like Nancy, and unfortunately that whole era, there's still a lot of, things that are happening to women in science. And so we wanted to kind of find some other stories that can represent different points on that sort of harassment iceberg. If you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. So that's how we ended up finding Dr. Rachel Burks and Jane Willenbring.
Great. Ian, anything to add to that?
Oh, that she captured it for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I guess in that same vein, something to keep in mind when watching the film is how many people we talked to in our research phase to get a sense of what people were experiencing, whose stories we couldn't include in the final film. So what you see in a way is sort of also kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the people we were able to connect with. But all of their stories, I think, informed the story we ultimately told.
Yeah, I was very curious about how you found these people and how you whittled down the list. Because one of the people who appears in this film, Sangeeta Bhatia, who's also an MIT professor, she's a very high-profile person. And, you cameo a few of these high-profile people, but their story doesn't quite converge in the way these three women's stories converges. So I'm curious about what other people's stories were on your list that didn't quite emerge as being central to the film that you ultimately made. Were there any other stories that were kind of just below the surface?
Ian, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
question.
No, it's a great question. There's always a bit of kind of trying to figure out what sort of movie you're making. Like, how big is your ensemble cast? Is it one main character with a bunch of support? Or is it? Kind of three main storylines is sort of a classic documentary structure, and we did spend a lot of time with some of the people who only kind of popped their heads in, as you said, and that was sort of heartbreaking to just be to have to whittle down their appearance to something small, but we felt their voices were really important. We spent a good amount of time with Dr. Kate Clancy, who does an incredible amount of research, and her research, as much as if not more than anyone else in the film, really, I think informed our work. Mahzarin Banaji, of course, as well. We liked the idea of trying to connect our three main characters with as many of those other voices in the film as possible, because in many cases they're already connected to them. We just weren't always there with the camera. Dr. Rachel Burks and Dr. Clancy are good friends. And in the end, we weren't able to include all of those scenes. I think you see Dr. Hopkins and Dr. Banaji in conversation at Harvard, and we would have loved to have more of, because that's so much of what science is about, is that sharing of perspectives and I think increasingly, interdisciplinary connections between scientists. So you're right. There were a lot of storylines that we couldn't include, and you end up having you know, really incredible scientists pop in for 15 seconds of your movie, which just feels crazy to us as well. But I think most people understand that, you know, documentary, the ratio of the footage you film to the final film is so is so large that hopefully folks don't take it personally, at least.
We actually, there was another there was another group that we interviewed, these women at Dartmouth who were sexually harassed by their professors, their neuroscience professors. And there's like a huge lawsuit that just happened recently that they settled for $14 million with Dartmouth.
Oh, wow.
So we interviewed with all of these women who came forward in this lawsuit, and then we weren't able to include that in the film at all, which we were so, you know, it's just, there were so many stories. It was 93 minutes or 96 minutes already. And we were like, there's no way we can put this story in the film and do it justice. So we ended up making a short film out of just the Dartmouth story. So that's out now. That's like touring as part of a festival called Luna Fest online.
And what's the name of that film?
It's called The Scientists versus Dartmouth.
Okay, great. Well, so I'm also curious about when this film was released, because it was right on the heels of Me Too. And you two both have, you know, this long track record of working on sort of a number of different environmental and social justice causes. But because of this film, it seems to me that your work and your Instagram site have put you right at the center of becoming advocates for gender equity in science. And I wonder, did you see yourselves falling into this role? And how did the timing work with Me Too and the conception and filming of this movie?
Yeah, it was interesting because it seemed, at least like when we were trying to fundraise for this film, like I don't know, there was kind of we were getting two different messages. I think from the science community, it was like, oh yeah, like nobody's talked about this. It's about time. We should totally, like, I want to see this film made. There was some trepidation behind the scenes from some funders who were like, maybe this is too radical. Like maybe we shouldn't talk about this stuff, you know, but I think most people were pretty like, let's do this. And then from the film community, there was more of like, oh, we've already seen this. Like, you know, Harvey Weinstein's already, you know, like it was sort of like we've already seen this. It's a Me Too story. And so we had this really interesting situation where we would try to pitch the film and we were like, no, it's not just a Me Too story. Like this is something that literally every woman scientist deals with. And like how, you know, and also it's just such a unique situation in the sciences where people believe that they're unbiased. You know, this is like this meritocracy, like your gender doesn't matter, you know, it's only your ideas that matter. And we know like research shows that that's actually not the case, but I think a lot of people still believe that. And so there's this weird like juxtaposition, and we really wanted to explore that in the film. But it was hard to explain that to like film people, you know. So that was, at least that was my experience as we were kind of, you know, trying to make the film. And I think, but once it's come out, I do think that, well, at least certainly in the science community, it's like the response has just been crazy. Like it's been overwhelming. The number of screenings we've done and the response we've had, and like our Instagram channel where people are can share anonymous stories of their own, you know, experiences in the sciences. It's just like, oh yeah, this is hopefully a starting point where people can start to talk about these issues.
Yeah, I had a chance to look at your Instagram site recently, and I was shocked at the number and the outpouring of experiences that women around the globe have shared at that site. So you've really nucleated something, I think, for which people felt a need. So the Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival this year is about alliances. Daniel mentioned this in his intro. And in this film, there's two allies that really came across to me. One is Robert Brown, who was provost at MIT at the time of the MIT report, and then became the president of BU at the time of the Marchand case. And then there was Adam Lewis, who was a master's student at the time when Dave Marchand was was working in Antarctica, and he has published a lot with Dave Marchant, and he was there and was a good friend of Jane Willenbring. So to me, these two allies were kind of allies in different timeframes and in different ways. And I wonder, did you see other allies, and were there aspects of their allyship that you think you could promote for other people who want to be allies to women in science?
Yeah, I think allyship is in many ways its own film. I suspect we barely scratched the surface of what it can look like, what it should look like, all the work that is needed, really, from allies and from men in science. There's just it's sort of another massive iceberg of work that needs to be done and thought through and explored, I think. And I think what we wanted to highlight with those stories was, particularly with Robert Brown, the importance of leadership, the importance of people in leadership roles stepping up and doing what they think is right. And I think because even as we kind of problematize the way in which science is so hierarchical, it's still hierarchical, and universities are, and so I think leaders still wield an enormous amount of power over the culture of science. So the more they, and the former president of MIT, who came to Nancy Hopkins and her group's aid in recognizing what MIT had really done in discriminating against the women faculty. That's a kind of allyship that is just so kind of can't be underemphasized. So that, we wanted to for sure mention that. And I think with Adam Lewis, I think for many people, he's a kind of complicated figure in the film, to say the least. And, because he acknowledges that he just really didn't, in his words, didn't see what was going on. And I think it's, I've kind of thought a lot about him and myself and kind of put myself in his shoes as much as I could. And I think that's a place where we wanted men in particular, men in science in particular, to be asking themselves, oh yeah, like when have I stepped up or not stepped up? When have I spoken up or not spoken up? And also, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? I think the foundation of good allyship is in many ways good vision and good listening. I mean that not sort of literally, but being aware of what's happening to other people who are who don't kind of look the part in science in the traditional sense. So that's with those two men, it's part of what we were trying to scratch at. But I think part of what you're getting at with the question is this idea of like allyship is a really big important aspect of what can change in science. And I think the last thing I'll say in this long rambling monologue is just that I've really come to believe it should take a lot of different forms, and can take a lot of different forms. And it's not about sort of ticking some box of like, oh, an ally does this, and like, where's these clothes, or where, it's like, no, it involves some creativity, it involves listening, it involves perception and being aware of what's around you. So
yeah, and it really came across to me in your film that even Robert Brown, who was such a great ally, he and the president of MIT needed to have the data brought to them. So, they required the women to do all this work to bring them the data that were there, that the institution could have found. And it's kind of a similar feeling to me with Adam, where, he has this really poignant conversation with Jane, where he's saying, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And she kind of says, she's talking about women getting a key passed to them at a scientific meeting. And he's saying how proud he is of these women for just blowing it off and like not making a big deal of it. And she says, I don't know that we should be proud of them, because somebody should be standing up to this lecherous old guy and telling him to knock it off. Mm-hmm. And if you're the woman who stands up, you're likely to look like you're complaining too much and get run out of science. And so then you need an ally to sort of see what is not on the surface, which is that it can be harmful, even though a woman is acting like it's not a big deal. So I'm really grateful that you brought out that aspect of how challenging it is to be an ally, how much work you have to do. So another question that came from the audience was, why was it important for you to spend so much time with Adam, who was, of course, the other graduate student with Jane in Antarctica?
I mean, I think it was the same reason we spent time with or at least, I mean, for me, like, I think Adam is a great stand-in for like so many people, like as a person who is there and who saw the same events unfold, but just didn't understand them in the way that like Jane had this stuff happen to her with David Marchant, and she experienced it a completely different way. And it wasn't until she told Adam, until he like really understood what had happened, that he got it. And I think it's really important to see that, to be like, oh yeah, this is like, oh, like that was happening right under my, right in front of my eyes, and I just didn't realize. I think that's really powerful. And like, frankly, I think about all the times I'm probably still doing it, that I'm not realizing. But I think for pretty much anybody, I hope, who watches the film, they can wonder whether they've, been in that situation and been like Adam. And I don't think we shouldn't like shun Adam or something. Like, I think he's a stand-in for so many of us. But I also think it's really important. We talked to Adam. We also talked to the anonymous woman who was also one of David Marchant's grad students, and they all have very similar stories. So they corroborate what Jane's saying. And I just think it's really powerful to hear, oh yeah, this person has a pattern, and not that we have to always corroborate everything that a woman is saying, happened to her, but it does make her case really strong.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine that it was a challenge to film some of these really poignant scenes. Another scene that for me really hit home, or that was very poignant, was when Rachel Burke is talking about all the extra time she has to spend composing an email. And, when she's describing that, she's close to tears. She's fighting back tears. And there's other times when other characters in the film are also fighting back tears. So it seems like that could be very challenging to film. What was the most challenging part of filming this documentary?
I guess I could talk about, like, so we kind of split up filming. So I did some of the early shoots with Jane, including her interview. And I did Nancy's interview, and then Ian conducted Rachel's interview. But we were like, and we both be on some of the shoots, or, so it's sort of like, that's kind of the nature of co-directing, is we can hand things off. But for me, like, just hearing the personal stories, like hearing, we did Jane's interview over the course of a full day, and it was really intense. And I know it was hard for her too. And just hearing like all of the things that she had gone through and how hard it was for her, thinking about her daughter. It was really hard to hear. And when I came into the interview, I thought that so the story was still unfolding. I didn't realize that at that point, David Marchant had not been fired from Boston University. So when I conducted the interview with Jane, I was like, yep, it's all wrapped up. And then she told me that he was not fired, that they were still waiting on this decision from the faculty committee. And so it was in that interview that I was like, what? Like, are you serious? And so it wasn't until later that we found out about the decision. So that was really hard, just like how this is like an overwhelming mountain of evidence, and still, you know, this guy is still on paid leave.
Yeah. Well, that relates to a question we have from the audience. Someone asked, was it important for you to use Adam's testimony to prove the validity of the claims against David Marchant? And I guess since you're filming it at a time when there were still decisions to be made, did you feel like you could really impact those decisions?
I don't, yeah, you go ahead, Ian.
No, I don't think our filmmaking process was in fact, I know, you know, we didn't have any impact on anything that happened, at least as far as we could possibly imagine. But we, you know, we did, of course, feel it was important to hear from other witnesses of what Jane had experienced, and I think, you know, maybe even more importantly, we wanted to understand, you know, Adam's thought process as an ally, as we already described. So.
Right. Well, here's another really excellent question from the audience. This viewer says, I recommend this film to people partly because of the explanation of implicit bias. So there's this lovely scene you have of this association test. How do you think your film will land with viewers who do not understand or believe in implicit bias?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, you know, despite a lot of this research, which is really overwhelming, there are people who say that it doesn't exist or that it's not a factor in why there's so few women and, you know, still in science. I mean, I think, frankly, I think that scene kind of speaks for itself. Like, you can, in the room, you can see the lag time. You're like, oh, interesting. I hope that people who watch that, and, you know, if they have any curiosity, I hope that they go and take the test, because you can take it online at Project Implicit. I think it's projectimplicit.org, but don't quote me on that. But it's called Project Implicit, and you can take this test for yourself. So, you know, I think the numbers don't lie.
So another question that I really had was, so the MIT report, which is sort of what guided you into this project in the first place, was about 2 decades ago, and it showed both salary and space inequities. So you now have had the chance to, you know, see this, have this film be seen all over the world and talk to lots of people about it. Do you feel like those problems have been solved? So, or do you think we're not so much further than we were when this came out 20 years ago?
I think it's pretty clear that those problems have not been solved, but I think it's also clear that progress has been made. And so I think one of the questions we found ourselves asking was, you know, is the progress at the right pace? And I think there seemed to be not a consensus exactly on how you measure that, but a sort of informal consensus among the people we spoke to, or, you know, because there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different things to measure. But was definitely, I think, an informal consensus among the folks we spoke to that the progress has not been fast enough. You know, that there's an incredible amount of inertia. I mean, it is sort of this like moving an iceberg thing. You know, there's an enormous amount of inertia built up over the years of just, you know, institutionally, and the implicit bias is sort of baked into individuals and systems and funding systems and the media, that all affect the way the culture of science is. So that's not to excuse any of it or excuse the slow progress, but I think we have to, we found ourselves, at least as filmmakers, trying to assess the situation and kind of look honestly at where we are and how much progress have been made and come up with some reasonable depiction of that we could share in the film. And I think that's where we kind of came out. I hope that doesn't sound too convoluted, which is like, we are making progress. It's not fast enough. And there's reasons for that. And if we look at those clearly, maybe we can find a way forward.
Yeah, well, that really segues into the next question I wanted to ask you. And because you have been put in this interesting position of interacting with so many people on this issue, from your sort of outside of science perspective, are you seeing policies that you think are especially effective at fighting some of these institutional challenges around race and gender in science and beyond?
I can't say, like, I don't know specific policy names or anything, but it does seem like from the people we've talked to social scientists and, the women at MIT who, went through all of this. I mean, it sounds like having a dedicated person on staff who's like looking at who to hire and like where to hire people from and kind of being really intentional about who to hire and kind of keeping the numbers of women and people of color up in your institution is really important. And also checking salaries and lab space and just kind of checking those, making sure that things are about equal, because apparently, I mean, I don't know if, I think I heard something about, or we're reading a study about how women, tend to not negotiate as much sometimes, or, maybe we don't ask for, enough or whatever. I don't know if that's true, but, but there is some data that shows that women tend to, like, over time, their salaries won't increase exponentially in the same way as men. So those are really important. There's a study out of this social scientist we interviewed, Sapna Cherian at the University of Washington. She talked about the study at Medgar Evers College. And I think it's Medgar Evers. No, I'm not sure. But they had like 10 years ago, they had really, really bad numbers of women in their computer science program. And so then they decided to start, like, they looked at like what were the criteria for women going into computer science, and they realized, oh, there was this, you're supposed to take intro computer science in high school. And it's like, well, how many women are going to take, they're going to think that they could go into a computer science course in high school. Odds are not many. And so they ended up like taking out that, that barrier and then having like 2 courses. So you could either take intro computer science in college, or you could kind of do this other course that was a parallel, but it wouldn't move you faster. So then they were able to like increase the women in their computer science course in their program by 50%. So now it's like even. And so that's pretty incredible that you can think about like who's coming into the program and like what your kind of barriers to entry are. And that all happened because they put a dedicated person on staff focusing on that issue. So.
Wow. Cool. Well, I think that's an excellent suggestion. Thank you. So another question that came from the audience is, and I think this is something you're interested in telling us about too, where is this film available to watch if you're not part of a group like this, like a film festival? For example, could undergrad STEM students have access to this film?
Yes. So couple answers there. The film is available educationally through a platform called Film Platform, and through ProQuest. And I'm not entirely sure how it works because I don't have access to those things, not being part of an institution. But through our distributor, Roco Films, our educational distributor, they make the film available to college campuses through Film Platform and ProQuest. So that's one thing to look into. And if the film is available through that, then great. If not, the film is going to be broadcast on PBS, which is public television, which everybody has access to, on Nova on April 14th. And there's information about the broadcast on PBS Nova's website. And then a few months after that, the film will be available for streaming. But those first two options are your best bet in the near term.
Awesome. Yes, I think people will really love seeing it on Nova. That's exciting. So you mentioned that when you first met Nancy Hopkins, you just fell in love with her and you thought she was such a warm and vivacious character. She came to visit UMass probably about 10 years ago. I was a young junior faculty at that time. And I remember having a conversation with her where she told a group of women who were all young assistant professors that in order for her to succeed in science, she didn't feel that she could marry and she didn't feel that she could have children. So she said she was the nun of science, you know, she was like married and dedicated to science. And I, you know, for 10 years, I've remembered sort of that feeling. So I'm curious about when you were making this film and talking to women scientists, what other kind of sacrifices you heard about, like you know, making yourself the nun of science in order to even be able to have the opportunity to pursue science.
Yeah, like with Nancy's generation in particular, like we did interviews with all, you know, as many of the MIT 16, you know, that we could, and we did them all at once. Actually, we had like a big weekend event in Cambridge, in Boston, and just like, you know, interviewed everybody back to back. And a lot of those women chose not to have kids. I don't know the exact like stat on it, but it was pretty striking to me. And, you know, I think it was a common feeling back then that you couldn't, you know, but there was no support, and I get it. So, you know, and with Nancy, like she said that she was like, you know, basically originally she was married as a young scientist, and she was like, you know, I'm just going to stay married and I'm going to, you know, get through this, and I'm going to win a Nobel Prize by the time I'm 30, and then I'm going to quit science and have a family, because she like 30 was the cutoff, you know, back then for having kids. And so she was like, I'm just going to do it by 30, and then I'm just going to leave, you know. And then what happened was she ended up getting a divorce. And so it was around 30 that she ended up getting a divorce, and she was like, well, and then she got offered a faculty position at MIT, you know, so it kind of made her decision for her. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, so the kids thing seems like the big one that really stood out to me. I'm trying to think if there were others, like other, you know.
I wonder this isn't the same. And I never heard anyone describe it with the word sacrifice, but it occurred to me when you asked that question that so much of what the women we spoke to were sacrificing in so many cases was a kind of justice, a kind of ability to speak up and to say this isn't right here, you know, this is my colleague's being mistreated, or I'm being mistreated, or it's not right that I don't have access to this, or I have to spend so much time composing an email, as Dr. Burke said. You know, that's a kind of sacrifice, I think, that people were making to stay in science. And I did come to see it as a, you know, as a kind of a loss, and don't want to go farther and put words into people's mouths. But I think that's a kind of intangible sacrifice that it's different from not having kids, but it's still really important to keep in mind.
It struck me also, Ian, when you were saying that like just time and like the amount, like, you know, feeling like, I don't know, there's this feeling of like, you know, you expect, or a lot of places expect people to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion and not be paid. And it's sort of like a second job, and oftentimes the people who are being oppressed are the ones asked to do those jobs and for free, on top of being like, high quality researchers. They're, also mentoring all these people and trying to kind of make science a better place. And that's seems exhausting. It's a lot.
Yeah. For me, in watching the film, there's this moment at the end where Nancy's holding the lab note or the notebook with all the details from the MIT report and reflecting on what could I have done with my science if I hadn't had to spend all this time fighting for gender equity. And that was just so poignant. All she wanted to do was science and have like equal space and equal pay to do it. It was a very poignant moment for me.
Yeah.
So one of our viewers commented, "This is such a beautiful film in many ways. Can you comment as filmmakers about how your aesthetic style helps you tell the story?" And I have to say, I agree with this person completely. It was an absolutely beautifully shot film. I really enjoyed it visually.
Well, I really love the animations in the film, and they are, to Sharon's credit, she designed those, and after these discussions we had about kind of wanting to evoke old textbooks and sort of like this old textbook look of science, which was sort of, if you flip through a science textbook from the 50s, it's a lot of guys in there. So we like this idea of kind of swapping out some of that imagery and sort of playing with that. And anyway, I think just Sharon did a really beautiful job kind of envisioning that and like helping put all of our graphs into that world. The footage we shot with our cameras was kind of challenging for us, I recall, at the time, because so much of what people were describing was in the past. It's hard to film bias unfolding because the camera introduces this sort of, changes people's behavior, sort of. So we couldn't really make a film where we were just sort of there all the time, capture it, or we actually chose not to try to make that film. We chose to make a film where we talked to folks and then tried to kind of evoke visually some of what they experienced without doing explicit like recreations or something. But, I don't know, there were times when we found ourselves just sort of filming a lot of hallways and kind of scratching our heads. And it reminded me of another film I worked on about emoji. And I remember being on a shoot with my co-director on that film. And it's like, what do you take pictures of? It's like pretty much emoji are on people's phones. It's going to get boring fast. So anyway, a lot of hallways, and, there's sort of a slippery slope in making science documentaries of like, you end up with a lot of shots of people holding test tubes and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh man. So I'm delighted that the film still has a kind of visual appeal. We did work hard to craft a certain tone and feel with the visuals. So.
Yeah, I felt that there was really a consistency that came through it, and those graphics were so meaningful when these bars that were so small, and you'd hope that it would get up to 50 and it would stop at 26%. It was just really poignant. So a question I wanted to ask you is, to me as a scientist, this film really strikes me a lot. It touches me in a personal way, and I really connect with it. But you have made films that are about all sorts of things that are injustices in various ways, or environmental problems in various ways. And so I wonder if you could put kind of on a scale how Picture a Scientist has been relative to other films and sort of the impact of what you're representing. What kind of impact it's making on you, on audiences, on the world.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about me. I mean, I think, well, certainly like as a woman who left science, who was a forest ecologist, who left, I think a lot about, like, because I didn't have experiences like the women in the film, but talking with all these women that we've talked to, it sounds like a lot of people didn't have really negative experiences when they were young scientists, but those experiences started to come out when they became older and they were competing for grants and, you know, becoming more of a threat to their male colleagues. And so I often wonder, like, what it would have been like if I had stayed, because especially, you know, forced ecology is a fairly like male driven, or, you know, historically it's been a very male driven profession. But I don't know. I mean, my mentors were men and they were wonderful. So I don't know. I think about that a lot. Like, I'm really, really not sure. And I've obviously, like, I've dealt with a lot of these issues in science, or in TV and film. You know, it's not different, unfortunately. So that's been, you know, and Ian knows, like, we've talked about this a lot. So I, you know, making the film, I was really like heartened to know that I wasn't alone, and that like a lot of people, probably the majority of people, deal with this in some way, you know. And I'm just really happy to see, like, so like in terms of my other film, I made a personal film about growing up with a parent who's transgender, and that film also was on PBS, which is great. But it's definitely, this is like a totally different magnitude of response from audiences. And I think it's probably also because, like, women scientists online are just like so passionate and so well connected with one another, and they just want to talk about this. And it's great, you know, it's really like, and I don't think there's any other film out there that's done what we've done and, like, you know, gotten into this space. And so it's really like become this lightning rod. And I love seeing that. So I'm really proud that it's, you know, that it's the thing that people are kind of converging on, you know?
Yeah, I will tell you that I am organizing this international meeting for this summer, and we were thinking about what we want to do for equity and diversity. And, you know, one of the things was, we said we could have a screening of Picture a Scientist and a discussion. And we said, well, there are a few groups that have already done that. And then people said, you know what, there's not too much. It's a great film, and we think there are still plenty of people who haven't seen it, and it nucleates a lot of valuable discussion. So I agree that you have really, really kind of made an impact, and not even kind of, that was more qualified than it should have been. You have made an impact, and I can see it reverberating around the scientific community. So awesome. I hope that you feel very, very proud of that work. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So one other question I wanted to ask you is, you know, there were several moments in the film, I've mentioned some already, that really stood out to me. Another one that I haven't talked about is this moment where you're showing this beautiful scene of like a mountain, and Jane's in a car driving, and she says, it's almost like a voiceover, but she says, a ton of feathers is still a ton. And so for me, you know, that's one of sort of these takeaway messages that I've really been feeling, you know, especially since I just rewatched the film very recently. And I'm curious about, for the two of you, are there any sort of takeaways, either visuals or statements, that you really took away from your making of this film?
So much. You know, as Sharon alluded to in her last response, you know, I think this made us look not only at science, but also at film and media and our own lives and experiences. And for me, that's definitely been true. I think the ton of feathers, or that kind of vast iceberg of microaggressions and subtle everyday slights, that stuff has really stayed with me. I think partly through the Me Too movement, we became aware of some of the really egregious and explicit and horrible acts of harassment in our society. But I think in many ways the harder stuff to see is that are those are those everyday slights and the, you know, the exclusions and the, you know, the looks and the side comments or the things said or not said. And that stuff is massive. And I think it's, it really, really, and it's everywhere. It's not just in science, and it's baked in to so many places. And that can sound depressing and overwhelming, but I took away from this sense of like, oh no, we can learn to see it. We can, you know, social scientists are studying it. They are unpacking this with us and for us, and we can learn to see it, and we can do better, and we have to.
So another question that has come in from the audience is, you know, kind of related to what we've been talking about, that there are these baked in biases that we all suffer from. You mentioned in your film about this study where there were two identical resumes sent out, and not only was the male candidate who was identical to the female going to be paid more, another part of that study was that people, males and females, wanted to pay the male more, but males and females were more willing to mentor the male than the female. And, you know, so it's so baked in to all of us. So we've been talking in most of this discussion, this is what a viewer points out, that we've been talking about sort of top-down kind of considerations for bias. But this person asks, have you thought about looking bottom up? For example, women and people of color student evaluations are often statistically lower than white men's because students have their own bias. And I wonder if there's anything that you've come across in your filmmaking that that sort of led you to think about how bias is sort of coming from both sides, from the top and the bottom.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And like we, you know, talking with the people in the film, like, and also doing Q&As with Jane Willenbring and Rachel Burks and Nancy Hopkins, and the social scientists in the film, there are like, they all have, you know, interesting ideas and kind of ways to try to combat bias, implicit bias. And so like, for instance, Dr. Mazar Banaji, she, in her own office, she hangs up posters and, you know, photos of women doing stereotypically male jobs, particularly women of color. So like a Black woman being a construction person, or, you know, working on a construction site, just to sort of, and she switches them out over time, but it's just to kind of, it's just this unconscious thing. And she's just trying to kind of train her brain differently, you know? And I think that that's a kind of an interesting, you know, it matters what you hang up and what you see in your office or like in your lab. Sapna Cherian, a social scientist, she does a thing where she has like a, you know, money jar, like a little change jar in her office. And so when they do their like lab meetings, if you interrupt somebody, you have to put money in the jar, because studies have shown that men tend to interrupt more than women in these group meetings. And so it's just sort of a thing. So it just reminds you that you pay more attention, you know, after a while. So I think something like that could be a cool way to try to, like, you know, sort of try to change the culture of a small group of people. Yeah. And then I don't know, like on the individual level, I think it's really nice, you know, and important to take the project implicit test and to just, I think talking about this stuff is really helpful, and like being just starting to be aware of that it is, you know, it exists, it's pervasive. I think that's the first step in combating it. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. This has been a really enlightening and wonderful discussion. I think we just have enough time to get some final thoughts from each of you. I think I would say in closing that really, you know, spending a lot of time thinking about this film, I really am thinking about Adam Lewis. And, you know, Adam Lewis observed what was going on with Jane Willenbring, but didn't notice. And I'm sure I'm doing the same thing. I'm observing either things I do or things that others do where I could act like an ally. I could be more aware. I could be more in their shoes. And it's easy for me as a woman to say that I'm on the receiving end, but I also have a lot of power. And so I'm actively working to become more aware of that. And this conversation and your film have really sort of helped me think about that. So thank you. If either of you have last thoughts you'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you.
I'll just say really briefly that for me is so much the reason we made this film. It's of course a story of three amazing women, and I think it's important to watch the film and see their stories and what unfolded. But ultimately, it's sort of about looking at ourselves and looking at our own behavior. That for me is the takeaway, and I think that's part of the reason why we named the film what we did. It sort of asks the audience to picture a scientist. What do you picture? What should you picture? What might we picture in the future?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just so I'm really happy to hear, and particularly to know that you've watched the film twice with your son. It's really great to hear. I just think I hope that men and women and non-binary people, I hope that everybody watches this film and that it's not just a film for women scientists. I think this is really important for allies to be drawn into the conversation. And so, yeah, I'm just happy that it's out there. And, thanks for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Thank you. This has been terrific.
Thank you, Sharon and Ian, for this fascinating and really important film, and for joining us today to talk about it. And really special thanks to Jeannie Hardy for moderating such a stimulating discussion here. And also thanks to the UMass Biotechnology Training Program for their sponsorship for this event. Thank you to our audience. We're always excited to see your questions. Note that Picture a Scientist will still be available for streaming until midnight tonight on the MMFF website. And the film will premiere, as you just saw, on PBS on April 14th. I'd like to thank again my assistant curator, Nefeli Forni-Servudaki, and our incredible team of interns, whose names you will see at the end of our trailer following this event. The MMFF is presented by the Film Studies program at UMass Amherst, Barbara Zecki, Film Studies Director. Be well, thank you, and good night.
얘기 하나 주세요. 덕호. 아야.